not to do things for the younger generation, but to be enablers and supporters. Really be wind that can lift them up in the years to come, which are going to be such difficult decades.
This is a podcast called Walk, Talk, Listen. An attempt to connect people and make this world a bit better by sharing opinions and experiences based on the belief that everyone's perspective is true, albeit partial. My name is Maurice Blom, and I would like to welcome you to yet another episode of Walk, Talk, Listen. Good day, everybody. This is another episode of the podcast Walk, Talk, Listen. And as always, I'm delighted with today's guest, who will introduce himself. Tim, please go ahead.
Well, thank you so much, Maurice. It's such a pleasure for me to spend this time with you and your listeners today. I am a relentlessly curious person. I think that's probably my defining characteristic. It's led me to a strange sort of zigzag life. I've traveled the world as a young man in my 20s. I spent 2 years on the road in Asia. My career after that as an international development and environment communications specialist has taken me to more than 40 different countries as well, working with people in all kinds of different contexts, literally everywhere from Alaska to Zimbabwe. Along the way, as a journalist, I've interviewed people as diverse as Tibetan monks describing their experience being tortured in Chinese prisons, to senior economists at the IMF, the International Monetary Organization that guides the world's economies and helps bail people out in their crises. So I have this lovely map of the world. And I think one of the things that drives me in my life is filling that map in, not just what are the places, but how do those places operate? What are their ways of being, and how do very different people come at life, given the fantastic multitude of possible human experiences? Along the way, I've written 10 books.
10?
They became 10 books.
Correctly?
Yeah,
wow.
That's right.
Yeah.
I've written 10 books, and as a publisher over the last decade, I've been able to publish 100 more. And my publishing company is called Changemakers Books, and it is a house dedicated to books about transformation, both personal, social, environmental, global. And really for me, from my life of curious wanderings, I've seen that transformation is the key. It's something that really drives me. If you like, you could say that my life question is, what makes transformation possible? And my publishing company has basically been kind of like putting a bird feeder in your backyard. If you really love birds, you put a bird feeder up, it attracts the birds to them. So I've done that, and that has attracted to me all kinds of amazing people working on one aspect of transformation. And it's just enriched my life tremendously. And as a result, the sort of zigzaggy paths that I've taken from, growing up in a very average middle-class family in Canada, I feel so fortunate that I've been around the world and have met many interesting people along the way.
And Tim, was writing books something that happened within your family already, or are you the first author?
Kind of the first author, I should say. My grandfather wrote children's books for my father.
Okay, cool.
He didn't publish them, but he wrote illustrated children's books for him. And it's not surprising because he was a very literate man who spoke 7 languages and loved theater. He worked in many theaters as he grew up, although his career was selling barbershop equipment. But he inspired this love of language in my grandfather, who became a journalist. And then my father became a journalist, and I really started off my career writing as a journalist as well. But I was always interested not in the day-to-day things, but in the the bigger why questions of life. So I think I come by that part of desire to express what I'm discovering, what I'm learning through language, through a long line of my own family.
Okay. And did you study, for writing? What was your path after high school?
Well, I took an interesting path from high school. I decided to take a gap year between high school and college, which many people do, but I wanted to spend that learning about life outside of a middle class urban Canadian home. So I worked in the wilderness. I worked most of my time in oil rig camps in Canada's far north as a roughneck, in very dangerous jobs with men who were sometimes twice the size that I was, who lived very rough lives and careers. I learned to hide books, to not let anybody see I was reading a book. I'd be more likely to take a book and hide it inside a Playboy magazine. That's you wouldn't want people to see we're reading. That could really alienate folks. But it also taught me to respect people who grew up living in different and much harsher conditions, and realizing the people who my life depended on didn't care what I learned or what I knew or what kind of a smarty pants I was. They just wanted to know if I could keep them safe on the job too. And that was that matured me a lot before I went to university. Yeah. I also, in my late teens, became very religious. I kind of discovered God and got it into my head that everybody else should discover the kind of God I'd discovered, and was quite zealous and evangelical in my late teens and early 20s, much to the annoyance of my father. And yet I decided in university to study philosophy. So I got a 4-year degree program in philosophy, which taught me how to think critically. And the writers I was exposed to there also helped me question the things that I had taken as literally on faith. This is the way the world is. It helped me really question, think, and become curious about the world outside what I thought I knew. Travel, of course, greatly broadened my horizons. I went to Europe and spent 7 months kicking around Europe in the middle of my education, and learned that there was not one Christianity the way. There were dozens, maybe hundreds of very different Christianities, and some of the most violent conflicts that I ran into, every place from Northern Ireland to Israel, were fights between different brands of Christianity, each convinced that the other was the worst of all possible heresies. So by the time I graduated, a lot of the hard edges of my faith got knocked off me, but I was still left with a curiosity and a sense that there was a bigger meaning, purpose in the world, which drove me to continue my travels and led me ultimately to spending 2 years in Asia and doing weird things like spending time at ashrams of some of the Hindu god-men who everybody believes are God incarnate, God walking amongst us. And then Buddhist monasteries, which are very different, have a much more of an ascetic, getting rid of yourself, getting rid of your illusions way of life. And out of that time traveling, I sort of weakened the holds of the Western mind frame that I had grown up with. And that left me as, I think, a very flexible and open thinker.
And a question about, your fascination or your interest in faith and religion. Did that have to do, because you said, that your father was annoyed that you got so into it. Do you think it's because you felt something was lacking, in your upbringing, that you were searching for that? What was the reason that you started to be curious and so ultimately fanatic around it?
Well, the impetus behind my late teen conversion was actually a genuine mystical experience. I was spending that time out of school and walking alone under the stars of northern Canada at night. I really felt this powerful connection to something greater than myself, and really Christianity was all I'd ever been exposed to. It was kind of the only pot I had to put this mystical experience into. But then once I did that, other people who were devout Christians around me started telling me, well, all of this is involved and this is how you have to read the Bible. And I just sort of took it as face value because I just didn't know any different. And as my curiosity continued, I just began to see that pot was not big enough and kept searching for bigger and bigger pots to put all of my experiences in. But I was also really, really fortunate with many of the people who were my early Christian teachers who were themselves not dogmatic. I do recall some friends, when I told them I had decided to study philosophy, they were like, oh, but you know, that's a bad thing because it will lead you to question your faith. And I remember saying back to them, oh, I don't want the kind of faith that can't be questioned. I mean, to me, Christianity is not a crutch; it's a walking stick. I want to use it to better explore and discover what's real in the world. And indeed, eventually, that led me to part ways with Christianity, but not without keeping an awful lot of respect for those who follow that particular path, and with a lot of the wisdom that it contains. There were just things that kept me climbing and questing away from that particular faith. Although I don't consider myself an adherent to any particular path other than that of the way of curiosity and keeping on walking.
Come back to the walking later in our conversation. And another word that I heard you mention, and it seems to be very important. No, I'm pretty sure it's important because it comes back all the time on your websites and blogs as well, is transformation. And so can you maybe explain, why you're fascinated with transformation and why you think that's important? And what do you do with that concept?
Right. Well, transformation, if you like, seems to be the one constant in life. Things change. I really resonated when I came into Buddhist company with the notion of impermanence, that nothing is permanent or fixed. Everything changes. All things evolve, they die, they are reborn in different forms. That is really the essence of life. And so this process of transformation is really understanding the process of life. When I studied science, I found actual evolution was fascinating. Evolution took dinosaurs and over millions of years turned them into birds, right? That long pathway is an amazing one that these creatures learned how to fly. I think what makes human beings particularly fascinating is because our minds have evolved to pick up social cues, and our behavior is so flexible that we can actually change in a single lifetime. We are capable of doing what dinosaurs go from ground swamp crawling reptiles to flying beings. We do that through the power of our minds. We literally have learned to fly in less than 100 years. Now, of course, that's also created massive challenges for the whole planet. Yes, we're capable of amazing change, amazing transformation, but sometimes we don't know the consequences of that transformation. So now, especially with climate change and biological systems collapse at our doorstep, we have to learn how to fly quite purposefully again, very, very quickly compared to previous generations. So our challenges will only be met when we become truly adept at purposeful transformation. So that for me is why transformation remains a key word, not just one of curiosity, but really one of necessity. How can we make ourselves so capable of change that we can give up in our lifetime our massive dependence on fossil fuels?
So how we will do that?
That's one of the things I ask my authors. I'm constantly searching for good authors with keys to the puzzle, because nobody has all the keys to the puzzle. I've been fortunate, both in my work with large organizations like the World Wildlife Fund and the UN organization, the Green Climate Fund, to learn from people who know an incredible amount of technologies that are out there that actually really make it possible. There are things we can do, but more important, there's lots of things we can simply not do. One of my authors wrote a book called "What If the Climate Crisis," or "What If Solving the Climate Crisis is Simple?" What a breathtaking idea to begin with. And he says, basically, we just have to stop burning fossil fuels, and we have to do it very, very quickly. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean it's easy, but it's simple if we just keep that premise in mind. So sometimes an idea that reframes how we look at problems can unleash tremendous energy to helping us transform.
As a publisher, you publish a lot of books around that they are called Changemaker Books, but you're also doing other things, right? So just, yes. I would like to go quickly to the Changemakers Books. Let us describe the whole publisher and what you're trying to do, because that's also unique. Your model is also unique. So I would like to make that clear to the listeners as well, because I really like what you've tried to do. What you're actually doing, not try to do. Yeah.
I'll give you the origin story, if you like, about how Changemakers Books got started. We are one of 24 imprints within the larger publishing house called John Hunt Publishing. And my imprint was one of the first that John Hunt Publishing began with. And this is because I became very good friends with John Hunt, who founded my publishing company. He published some of my books before he founded this company. And he had this brilliant idea about 15 years ago to bring publishing into the 20th century by fully automating some of the systems, simplifying it, and making the break-even point for publishing books much different than it was in the industry at that time. At that time, the break-even point for publishing books was around 10,000 copies. That means any publisher whose books sold fewer than 10,000 copies was losing money year on year. And that meant that it was very hard for first-time authors to get published because, well, there's a catch-22. Publishing houses only want to publish authors who've shown they've got a good track record. But how do you get a good track record until you can get well published? It was very hard. I faced that frustration as a writer myself. So John's system took the break-even point down to under 1,000 copies of a book. And the purpose was to allow first-time authors to get started in the business and get some experience as authors, get published well. And he talked through with me over the course of about 2 weeks all the details, and we discussed all the ideas of this during a trek we took together, climbing through one of the most beautiful parts of the Himalayan mountains, Mustang in Nepal, which is a high altitude desert. It's beautiful, stark country. We had about 8 to 10 hours of walking per day, and we walked our way through this whole process that he had in mind. And near the end, he said, "Why don't you take on an imprint for yourself?" He wanted me to do his Eastern spirituality imprint because, of course, of my Buddhism practice and record. Yeah. But I immediately said, "No, I don't want to do that." I moved on from that. And he said, "Well, what would you like your imprint to be?" And honestly, without a moment's thought, Maurice, I said, "Well, I'd like it to be an imprint dedicated to transformation." And he said, "And what would you call it?" And I said, "Changemakers Books." And I'd honestly never thought about being a publisher, even when we were talking about all of this, until John made me the offer. And then it was just boom, boom. It was right there. Like something that had been waiting for me that I just hadn't discovered. Yeah. And so Changemakers Books was born then in that walk, which I believe was 2009. The other thing that was part of this company is John himself had been an author, and he really wanted to make the people who worked inside the company, people who were themselves authors, so that they could relate to and connect to authors and build a company for them, not a company that was just using authors to make a profit. So we tried to make things very author friendly. And for me, what that meant was having a personal connection with the authors that I published. And especially during the pandemic, when so many people were feeling so isolated, I began taking groups of authors and working with them on Zoom calls, literally as teams. I put out a series of books during the pandemic called Resilience, which was for authors to write books about things like coping with anxiety, like connecting with nature in times of great stress, using story to help you feel whole and connected to others. These things were really life-saving skills for people during the pandemic. But we worked together as a team. People read each other's drafts. They encouraged each other. They helped in various ways. And we put all these books out in 6 weeks. They're short 20,000 word books, but they were great. And this feeling of teamwork, like we were all on a rowing team together, was really, for me, it was inspirational. For the authors, it was inspirational. So I kept that up. Now I have regular Zoom calls with my authors to give them a sense that they're not alone. So they can review each other's books. They can read each other's manuscripts. One author who's a skilled graphic designer offered to help design the covers of more than a dozen other authors in a second series that I covered called Resetting Our Future. And there's really nothing more lonely than writing a book. So doing it together with others who are also in that same boat, rowing together, has been a very meaningful experience for many of them, and certainly for me. And Maurice, your listeners don't know this, but I invited you to be in on one of my author calls just recently to see what that was like, and also to participate in it and give some feedback as a podcaster. So thanks so much for being in that call, but also thanks for seeing what it was like. I think you're one of the few people who've witnessed collaborative authors live on Zoom.
No, and it was great, and the what I got out of it, I mean, many things, but I felt like, I'm witnessing a community that they've built, which is really an awesome thing. And especially, as you said, I think as an author, it can be lonely. And I think there is also, a lot to say in terms of that you have a community that you can go to, that know what you're going through. And then on top of that, at least if I look at the numbers that are also shared on the website, this particular publishing endeavor is pretty successful. So that is actually very extraordinary because of the the times that we are in. I don't know if that's true or not, but are people reading less, or has that increased again the last 2 years? How is that? So how is it to survive?
Publishers depend collectively on making more good calls than bad calls. Yeah. And indeed, the trend has been going down over the last 25 years or so, for obvious reasons. When the internet kicked in, you can not only find lots of things that you can read for free, but also social media, things like Facebook and Instagram and TikTok are endlessly distracting and amusing, and take away from the time that one used to spend reading a novel to pass your leisure hours. It's easy to get all that soaked up. So yes, reading trends have gone down. Interestingly enough, not surprising though, during the pandemic, there was what we called a reading bump. More people were reading because they simply had so much time. So publishers all across the board did better during the pandemic. But now guess what? Now that the pandemic is, for many of us, in our rearview mirror, there's a reading slump following that reading bump. And a lot of publishers are struggling. Indeed, John Hunt Publishing is quite fortunate as a mid-sized company because we made so many adjustments when John set this up to make our systems lean and not have a lot of overhead.
Yeah.
The company managed to not only be profitable through the pandemic, but still not be in crisis right now. And anybody who's not in crisis is a successful publisher at this particular time. Yeah. So many smaller publishers in particular have just been absorbed by the larger houses because it's hard. But to me, reading books, the process of having a long, thoughtful argument, a series of ideas, or a fantastic story, that's irreplaceable. And I'm going to be out there, they're publishing and helping people find great books to read, as long as people have eyes to read.
I've two questions still about the publishing side and about the community that you've developed and are maintaining. And one is, are you able to attract also younger authors, or are you leaning towards the more senior ones? I'm laughing because I myself also were part of that particular group. And the second question that I have for you, Tim, is have you, because you use Zoom to to build and to strengthen, to help each other, but I have understood that the reading bump was also due to development within TikTok, where especially young kids, well, relatively young people, are advertising, talking about books that they're reading, and that really helps it. So two questions for you.
Yeah. First of all, yes, when young people are reading, when they can share it on social media, that is a great way of spreading the word. So yes, that is happening, and that's good. Still, the overall trend is going down, but I have been really heartened by some of the young authors who've come my way. Now, I would say more of our authors are 40 plus, but I have had 3 just great authors that I would call millennials, or even younger than that in the last 2 years. 2 a couple of years ago were actually a young married couple. He wrote a really stunning book called Everything You Never Learned About Sex, which was, as a young man, writing about the challenges and problems that young men face that he saw as really destroying their ability to have healthy, fulfilling sexual lives. And he really took aim at pornography, which is so normalized in our culture. But he really talked about the ways that pornography is killing men's natural sex drives and sex responses to women. Brilliant book. And then his wife, who's a fantastic entrepreneurial woman, and in her mid-20s, she had a multi-million-dollar company based on selling flavored dessert hummuses. That's something I'd never even heard of before. But she wrote this great book called How to Lead a Badass Business from the Heart. And it was, her sharing her own wisdom as a young woman, getting out there and making a successful business thrive. Cool. And then more recently, right in production right now, we've got a lovely book that's being written by a former fashion model who now has her own fashion line. And it is all about sustainable fashion. And the problems that the fashion industry has created from an environmental perspective, and also what we can do in terms of making sustainable choices for the clothes we wear. Brilliant. And so her book is in production, so I expect it out next year.
Okay, nice. And so just to be really clear, so the question that I asked was really referring to your Changemaker book series, but the publisher as a whole, or John Hunt as a whole, of course, has all kinds of books that the publisher is publishing, right? So I assume
that's right,
that there you will have more millennial authors in those on those subjects.
That's true, and many of the other imprints are devoted to alternative spiritualities, which I think attracts a lot of people. There's a whole imprint which focuses on books connected to paganism, and there's an awful lot of young people who find ancient Celtic spirituality or Wiccan and the whole panoply of alternative religious wisdom that's out there for us, goddess spirituality, also all of these things. These are all parts of John Hunt publishing that I think do draw young people quite well, as well as fiction books. Books for young. We have young adult fiction line as well. So my audience might tend to skew older than than most because of the focus on transformation.
Okay. I would like to go to your books, actually. You shared you've written 10 books. I have a quick questions about your last 3. I will start with asking a question about your pro-truth movement book. That's your last one, right?
Pretty much. There's a small one after that.
Tell us about it, because it was what you try to do is create a movement that would have an influence on the 2020 U.S. presidential election. So, we are 3 years after. So, did your book do what you hoped it would do?
Yeah. So here's the book. In short answer, yes.
Okay.
This book was really a reaction by myself and my co-author to the Trump presidency, particularly the meme of post-truth that came out with that, where it didn't seem to matter that Trump lied about many things, lied frequently and obviously, and that was being normalized. And both my co-author and I were like deeply wounded and angered by this. And so we pushed back with not post-truth, but pro-truth, really making a case that truth matters in a democracy, and that there were things we could do to counter the post-truth tendency that our politics had taken. Even while many in the media were just saying, "Oh, this is the new reality, this is the way things are," we really wanted to make the case that that could not happen, would be bad for democracy, and that there were ways that individuals could protect themselves, strategies for recognizing lies and turning them around to strengthen your sense of what was real rather than the falsehoods being promoted. Now, my co-author is actually the one behind the pro-truth movement, and he has on the website the pro-truth pledge, which are simple promises that anybody can go to the website and sign, that the pledge that you will not pass things on social media that could be false, that you will correct errors where you find them, and that you will take a sense of responsibility for your own political talk and let's call it the bubble that you live in. Can you cleanse your bubble of lies? That's what we look at doing. Mm-hmm. So these are individual skills that we offer that are not only for making your bubble better, but then can be spread to others through the ripple effect. He's really the master of this. This is Gleb Tsipursky. He's a doctor of behavioral economics and cognitive neuroscience, and he's done tests and experiments and an awful lot of research on our cognitive biases, the way our minds can trick us, and what it takes to help us find our way back to truth.
Okay. No, I think it's fascinating, and basically you have 3 big tips, for the reader, how he or she can work on that. 2 quick last questions about that book, Tim, is, one, is it also relevant for a non-US audience, you think? Because you're traveling a lot around, so you're seeing what's happening around the world. And then the second question is, elections are coming again in this country within 2 years. I find it always fascinating that one is finished and then they start talking about the next one already. So I think we can have several podcasts about that particular topic. But will it still be relevant, this book, for the next election?
So the answer to both questions is yes. It was, now I'm trying to remember what the first one was. So yes, it'll be relevant for both elections, and it's also not simply America focused. We, for example, draw a lot of examples from the Brexit referendum and the lies that were promulgated, like that the British healthcare system would be saving £350 million a week. Just plain a lie, and yet the forces in the pro-Brexit campaign had a bus which went around London with that written on, and they didn't take it down even after it was debunked by the media. And I think Great Britain right now is suffering the costs of believing a lie like that. And we talk about other contexts as well that are outside of America. Is it relevant? Indeed, the one thing that I sort of look at with chagrin, since this book was written in 2020, it's got none of what has become known as the big lie that Trump promulgated, that he, through election fraud, lost the election, as opposed to he simply lost the election and then made up fraudulent stories. And those fraudulent stories continue to be believed by many people. So I wish we could have included that in this book. But the principles are still relevant, and many of them are also still quite alive in our social consciousness. So we talk, for example, about Trump's repeated lie that Hillary Clinton was a crook. And we talk, well, how could one take that information? How could one take a lie like that and better deal with it? So the techniques that are there, the strategies that are there, and indeed the whole premise of the Pro-Truth Pledge, they're still there. They will be lasting through 2024, and I will be back on that particular horse when the next election comes around. One of the more valuable and constructive things that the Pro-Truth Pledge does is it encourages public office holders to sign the pledge, taking a vow, in other words, that they will themselves not spread falsehoods. And we're very fortunate to have had several sitting members of Congress take the Pro-Truth Pledge, including one person who ran for governor this year, and hopefully he will be running again. That means they vow not to use the destructive tactics of spreading lies about their opponents in their campaign. It's a big step. We believe we can make more inroads with that in 2024.
I really encourage the listeners to check out your particular book and the pledge and the website, etc. And another book that you wrote, I think the title was virtual. The topic is about virtual speaking. I have one question about that. How is virtual speaking different from in-person speaking?
Well, you and I are doing virtual speaking right now, and there are some things that people need to attend to. I'm sure you've seen this as a podcaster yourself, how many of your guests aren't properly framed, aren't properly lit, aren't properly mic'd. If those things are not good, then the person that you're speaking with doesn't come across as their best self. And our attention is so fragmented to begin with that in the virtual reality, it's very easy to ignore the person on the screen and what they're saying. You, I'm sure, like me and like all of your listeners, have probably been on various webinars where you just start doing your emails, or you start scrolling through your phone because it's just boring. You can't stand paying attention to what's being said on the screen. It's too dull. We are not experts at gaining and keeping the attention of our audiences. So all of these things are in this book.
Great. And was that one of the books that you published, during COVID?
Exactly. It's part of the Resilience series.
Okay.
So it's Resilience, virtually speaking, communicating at a distance. And really, for any of your listeners who use virtual communications, which is now just part of our lives, for not just day-to-day communications, but for meetings, if they're doing interviews, if they're doing presentations, even job interviews and things like that, it's a great resource because it helps correct the sorts of mistakes we just don't think about, but can actually seriously detract from our ability to be heard when we communicate online.
Okay. Last question is about your communication handbook. Yesterday, actually, I attended, your session with your authors, and they had to do a 30-second elevator pitch about their books. So if I ask you to do the 30-second elevator pitch about your communication handbook, how would it go?
All right, here it goes. Are you going to time
I'm sorry to put you on the spot, Tim.
All right. So the book is the Master Communicator's Handbook. And its premise is that communication can create transformation. And if you have a mission to make the world a better place, to create positive change, you can't do it alone. You need others to hear you. And this book gives you the tools that you need to make that possible. That's it.
Great. Thank you. I didn't time it, but I think you were pretty close. Hey, Tim, you like walking. You walk a lot. I think you just came back from a traveling tour, kind of, after during or after COVID, back in the US now. Around 11 years ago or 12 years ago, I started to do a 100-mile walk where I try to raise money and awareness around, ending hunger, poverty, and injustice. It means that I walk 15 to 20 miles a day, and during COVID, I was not able to be joined by a person to walk with me. So then I started this podcast, and it has gone on of hand. I mean, we're more than 100 episodes since then. But like what you alluded to, when you're walking alone or with others, you think about life. And so I've very often talks about spirituality, religion. And one of the topics that continues to come back is about youth and spirituality and religion. So my question to you is, what do you see happening with the younger population in your community around this topic? Can you share some of your observations? If you compare it with your own generation?
Yes, I have a small sample size for making any generalizations. The number of younger people I actually know well enough that I've had talks with about their spirituality or about their lives is fairly small. I can include in them my own son, who's now 32 years old, and he would not describe himself as a spiritual or certainly not a religious person, and I happily embraced that about him, because what he is somebody who's very connected and engaged in his own life. He's a professional improvisational actor. He's also a director and a teacher. And what really turns him on in life is showing people the skills of improv that can unleash their natural creativity. And he's really good at that. He also is great at making magic on stage out of nothing. Phenomenal skill sets. So I think the way that he engages in his life, the way he sees it as an adventure, is, he wouldn't call that a spiritual path, but to me it's a path of really being alive. And I think maybe if one framed it in that way, you would see in a good number of the younger generations, this necessity to be alive is really there. They're not satisfied to get on a career path and buy into the package of the home, the double incomes, the raising the kids in the suburbs, the retirement and golf courses template that is kind of the goal for many in, say, the boomer generations. And I like that insistence that life be more meaningful and more on their terms. I'm glad of that. I think there are also, first of all, the reality of climate change and the reality that 20, 30 years from now, things won't be like they are today. That's a hard burden for youth to bear. It could easily make people depressed, bitter, and angry. And although you do see that, I'm amazed at the number of people who instead are ready to embrace a life of activism and connection and caring about the planet. When I was in Paris last year on Earth Day, I stumbled into a wonderful protest by high school students who, had left school for the day, and they had all sorts of signs about protecting the planet and the change that we need to make. And they had their faces painted, and some of them had lively costumes, and they were there and they were protesting and they were chanting, but they had a joyful, hopeful energy about them too, which I thought, God, that is so beautiful. They feel connected to each other. This is an expression of their care, not just of their anger. And it made me happy. I think boomer generations, those of us who have taken so much, who have been so fortunate to live in generations that thrived due to fossil fuels, making our lives so easy, providing us with so many machines, so many opportunities to travel. We have a moral obligation to find a way to give younger people their opportunities to make of the world what they can. One of my newest authors has actually written a book, which is all about boomers and climate change. And it's time for us to pay attention to the legacy we are leaving.
No, so I mean, you're listing a couple of things. So a lot to worry about. Is it the youth where you still see hope, or are there additional things going on where you still see hope?
I do see hope, and I don't think that it's befitting of my generation to look to the younger generation to carry our hope. I think it really is up to us to give them a reason to hope, to show them our determination to leave the world better than we found it, our determination to stand up, not in front of them, not behind them, but beside them. This author of the climate book, Lawrence MacDonald, he introduced me to a great phrase, particularly applicable for white men in diverse communities, which is to stand up by standing back, to not assume that just because you're an old white guy used to your privilege, you then can stand in the front and tell everybody what they should do. But you can find ways to stand back, make room for others, create space needed, offer to provide resources, support, platforms like Changemakers Book is a platform.
Yeah.
Not to do things for the younger generation, but to be enablers and supporters. Really be wind that can lift them up in the years to come, which are going to be such difficult decades.
I want to piggyback a bit in terms of, the things that we need to do to ensure that that we take better care of the planet and ourselves, humanity. And I think one of the things that we have done as human beings is develop the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. They might not be perfect, but it's what we have, and it gives some kind of framework. Now, the last 2 years, we didn't make any progress on that. Some things got even worse. And there is now a growing group of people around the world that is saying that, one of the reasons that we are not making the progress that we need to have is because we did not pay attention to the skills, knowledge, and abilities that you need as an individual and as community to work on those goals. And as a result, they came up with the inner development goals. There are 5 inner development goals. So I have 2 questions about the SDGs and the IDGs, about the Sustainable Development Goals and the inner development goals. The first question is, Tim, what do you like my listeners or our listeners to know about the Sustainable Development Goals? That's one. And the second question is, what are your thoughts about the inner development goals?
Thank you. Great questions. I'm very fortunate in my career as a communications expert to have worked with so many organizations that have taken on one or more of the Sustainable Development Goals. And that includes the World Bank, the Asia Development Bank, the Africa Development Bank, many NGOs like the World Wildlife Fund. So all of these organizations are tackling pieces, and their work is in some cases truly extraordinary. It's almost impossible to keep up with the kinds of changes that are being developed on the front edge that are working towards meeting those goals. Where a lot of work needs to be done is figuring out how to connect these goals together so that people aren't working for them in isolation. When you work for them in isolation, you may be doing great progress on work, for example, ending poverty, but what might that actually be doing to creating sustainable food sources? Maybe your agricultural practices are feeding today, but at the expense of tomorrow. So needing to find ways to weave those 17 goals together so that they are being achieved as part of a global transformational whole is a task that no one has really been assigned to. And I've run across very few people who are even aware not only of the problems that can then create, but also the loss of synergies. Maybe people are doing amazing things in the water goals that could well be applied to education goals. But nobody's in the same room. So one person who I am hoping is going to be a future guest of yours, because she's also one of mine authors, has developed what she calls smart futures for a flourishing world. And her key is all about how do we start to see the sustainable development goals as clusters, and then put the clusters together and create linkages and laboratories where what's explored in one set of goals can then be applied to other sets of goals, and also so that they don't end up hurting each other at the same time. So this is, to me, something I would love to see us find a focus on in the decades to come.
Cool.
Now, your second question was on the inner development goals. And boy, there's a lot of work to be done there. From where I stand as someone who's obsessed about transformation, I would say that the sort of meta sustainable development, inner sustainable development goal is becoming flexible people, becoming people who don't have a way of doing things and don't insist that others do it my way in order to make it the right way. Our challenge is we have to be so flexible that our lives in 20 or 30 years will look nothing like what our lives are today, because they simply can't. We can't look at a future in which we are using fossil fuels, we're using the world's resources in 30 years the way we're using them today. It might be sustainable for a tiny number of very rich people. In other words, they might still be doing that, but at a greater and greater cost, not just to the rest of humanity, to the rest of the planet. So how can we make ourselves ready to embrace change? How can we learn to want less? How can we distinguish between what are our wants and what are our needs? You take a look at what's considered living a poor life in the United States today, and that would be living a very nice life by the standards of, say, the 1940s. And still is a life of luxury compared to what it's like in many of the poorest parts of the world today. There's a great line from a TV show I'm watching right now where a indigenous Native American and a very rich English woman from over 100 years ago are about to embark on a journey by horse across the West, and she's brought all these trunks of her clothes with her, and they just have two horses, and he says, "Well, you've got to decide what you need," and she says, "But I want to take everything," and he looks at her and says, "The difference between what you need and what you want is what you can put on a horse." And I think the message for humanity is we've got to saddle up. We're going to have to let go of a lot of baggage that there's no way that we can take with us and hope to get to a better future.
I liked it. Talking about the inner development goals, Tim, I always have to think about music somehow, because music is a very important part of my life, as the listeners know. And I have always a question about music as well. So my question to you is, if I ask you to come up with a piece of music or a song that best embodies who Tim is and for the big part, what you are about, which piece of music or song would that be and why?
Well, I knew that question was coming, so it gave me a good chance to think about it, Maurice. Thank you so much. Clearly, for a guy who's all about transformation, David Bowie's Changes is the song that came to mind and really resonated. And I actually have the lyrics right up here, so I'd love to read just a few of the lines, if that's all right.
Yes.
I watch the ripples change their size, but never leave the stream of warm impermanence. And so the days float through my eyes, but still the days seem the same. And these children that you spit on, as they try to change their worlds, are immune to your consultations. They're quite aware of what they're going through. Changes, turn and face the strange. Changes, don't tell them to grow up and out of it. Changes, where's your shame? You've left us up to our necks in it. Time may change me, but I can't trace time. Man, that was written in 1971. But for boomers who were digging it back then, it's really relevant to us today in a way we might not have expected.
Do you still remember when you heard that song for the first time?
I can't remember ever not knowing that song. It's always been there.
Yeah. Nice. And just to a reminder to all the listeners, that song will be added to the Spotify playlist called #Walk Talk Listen, where all the songs are added, that have been elected and selected by my guests. Thank you so much for that. Something that I started relatively recently, is really connecting you, with my community that is expanding now. All these guests that I'm so privileged that I can talk with you and the others. So I have a question for you, Tim, from the previous guest, and I hope you will be able to hear her. It's Pooja.
Question for the next person would be, what do you see as your life's purpose and why? In one sentence.
Okay. You're making it tough. Did you
answer it in one sentence?
Yeah.
Answer it in one sentence. I'm going to do that, but I'm going to answer it in more because it deserves more than one sentence.
Yeah, sure.
I believe it's up to each of us to create our own life's purpose. And for me and mine, it's been to be a facilitator of transformation. And if I can say a little more on that, one of the most amazing things that I've discovered in life is what happens when someone gets an idea and they're able to express it to others in a way that starts to create this energy. It might be two people, it might be Simon and Garfunkel coming together and writing songs, or it might be two scientists collaborating and creating a discovery that wins a Nobel Peace Prize. It might be a group deciding to overthrow a repressive regime. But when people come together around an idea, a hope, a vision, big change can take place. So I love facilitating this. It's like being a catalyst in a chemical reaction, or like being what it takes to have neutrons banging together in a way that starts a nuclear reaction that unleashes an incredible amount of energy. I find this every time I have a conversation with an author about writing a book, and you can see that book take hold of them and start to work its way out into a finished product in their lives. And indeed, somebody who's reading a book, that same process can happen. But that process just endlessly fascinates me. And I'm tremendously hopeful because the change that can be created out of that process of allowing transformation to take place, maybe simply by listening to a friend talk about their latest idea, is fabulous. Just lights my world.
Your question for the next guest.
Okay. My question comes from a dear friend of mine who I actually co-wrote a book with, who used to say this casually in conversation, and I realized, wow, that is a great way of thinking about your life. He used to talk about his life's question. So I would say for your next guest, what is your life's question?
Wow. A short question, but that's a lot to think about. Great. Thank you, Tim. Hey, Steve Hartman of CBS, I don't know if this is on the television or it's a series of a couple of videos, but he started something that he called The Gift. It's about one simple act of kindness, and that can create a ripple effect. What are your thoughts about, a simple act of kindness?
I really get that idea about kindness. And it comes to me around a question that people often do ask, especially in their later parts of their life, which is, will I be remembered? What's my legacy? What have I left behind? And some people think of it as their children. Some people think of it as, a deed that they did, whether you're Martin Luther King's, who gave the civil rights movement this transformational voice, or a war hero. There's so many individuals who really leave a mark, and we think, well, we'll remember them. So people get obsessed kind of about their legacy. And indeed, the truth is, your children may die out. I remember my grandparents, but I don't really know anything further back than that. They're just names that don't have much relevance to me for the most part. And similarly, almost any legacy is going to crumble over time. Maybe a very few will be remembered, but even those civilizations or ours will eventually crumble and disintegrate. So none of that lasts. But an act of kindness can not just change someone's attitude for a day, it can change their life. It can inspire them to turn around and do an act of kindness for others. So act of kindnesses create a ripple effect that create change that is no longer attached to your name. You can't put a plaque on it. And yet it creates truly sustainable, long-lasting change, which may have global implications. So I'm very fortunate that my own mother is the sort of person who used to do countless acts of kindness. And there's going to be no monument to her. People are going to forget about her. But she's changed so many lives by simple acts of kindnesses, they couldn't be numbered.
If I would ask you now, at this moment, come up with a simple act of kindness for somebody or something, what would that be?
If someone comes to you with a problem, rather than listening to them as if you've got the answer that you are ready to tell them, listen to them with a truly open mind so that you can help them find their own solution, and recognize that from inside their world, they see things more clearly than you see from the outside. And that's very fresh in my mind because I had the really good opportunity of speaking with a friend today who wanted to bring something to my attention, and I really knew how I felt about it, and I knew he wasn't going to like what I had to say about it. And my dear understanding wife Teresa really helped me, first of all, wait 2 days, stop feeling that I knew the answer. And I was able to really drop that, and as a result, the conversation really helped them, and it wouldn't if I'd just gone in thinking I knew how to fix the problem.
Tim, I mean, these conversations always go fast. My kind of last question to you is, do you have any message or any last question suggestion, anything you would like to share with the listeners or with me, or anything that I should have asked to you and that it didn't? Yeah.
Yes, I would say it's important to embrace change if we want to grow, if you want to transform, both personally and socially, to create change. And embracing change involves embracing discomfort. If you think about a caterpillar turning into a butterfly, that process involves enclosing itself in a cocoon and then having to fight its way out of a cocoon and then being incredibly vulnerable as its wings are drying. So struggle, discomfort, feeling very vulnerable. These things are part of getting to the transformation you want and you seek in your own life's unfolding. So to be accepting of change means to embrace discomfort. And that would be my hope for all of your listeners, is they develop those skills.
I would really like to thank you, Tim, for your time. And sharing your wisdom, your experience, your stories with me today and with the listeners. I would really encourage the listeners to check out, the website of your publishing company. I'm looking here at something that I copy pasted from your website, and that is a couple of things that struck my mind, and that you would like, or you're striving to be a dynamic, forward-looking, independent publisher that welcomes unsolicited manuscripts. So I think there are a lot of authors out there that are struggling and that are looking for, these type of opportunities. And then you're saying, we are looking for books that will inspire, inform, and illuminate the lives of readers. The sentence is longer, but I made this bold because that's what I hope this podcast is also kind of doing and contributing to. Thank you so much. And so, listeners, really check out the books that Tim has written himself, as well as the books that he has published, and follow him. It's all great stuff. Tim, thank you so much, and good luck with everything you do.
Thank you, Maurice. Gosh, it's been a pleasure to be your guest, and I'm so glad you've created this platform for all of your listeners to really think deeply as they walk, talk, and listen through life.
Yeah. No, thank you. Thank you so much.
This episode was made possible by the support of an organization called CWS. You want to be part of a movement? Well, sign up to become a sustaining partner. As a sustaining partner, you can make a difference in the world, automatically every month. Sustaining partners commit to a hopeful future by making compassion a part of their monthly budget. It could mean new systems to manage precious resources like water, or diversified ways of earning a living that make people more resilient. For as little as $10 a month, you can transform lives. You want to check it out? Well, go to cwsglobal.org/sustain. Thank you for listening to Walk, Talk, Listen. Please check us out on 100mile.org or follow us on Facebook or Instagram.